January 1943, Rabaul, New Britain. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa opens a report on his desk. Another convoy has reached Lai safely. This one, the one before it, the 14 before that. He folds the report, sets it aside, steps out of the room. 500 miles to the south in Brisbane's Australia, an American general is reading the same numbers. 13 separate attack missions over 2 days. Dozens of aircraft. 1 ship sunk. He opens his journal and writes one sentence. We are taking it on the chin. That American general's name was George Kenney. Washington had not wanted to send him here. MacArthur had already pushed out 2 air commanders before him. Men who couldn't deliver what he needed. Men who learned the hard way that MacArthur's patience ran short and his memory ran long. But Kenney hadn't come to keep his job. He'd come to solve a problem no one had solved yet. And 6 weeks after he wrote that line in his journal. 6 weeks. Mikawa would pick up a pen of his own and write back to Tokyo. It is certain that the success obtained by the American Air Force in this battle dealt a fatal blow to the South Pacific. 2 men. 2 sentences, 6 weeks apart. But this isn't a story about the battle itself. It's about everything that happened before it. A pilot who worked out the math on this thing and disappeared 6 weeks before it was ever used. A mechanic who bolted machine guns onto the nose of a bomber, built something no one had ever asked for, and proved it worked. And a question that Japan never answered in words, only in what they stopped doing after March of 1943. If this is the kind of story you want to stay for, go ahead and hit the like button now. Not for any complicated reason. Just because that's how these stories find the people who need to hear them. Now let's go back to the beginning. July 1942. Washington needed a new air commander for MacArthur in the Pacific. Washington offered MacArthur Doolittle first. You know the name. 4 months earlier, Doolittle had led 16 Army bombers off the deck of a Navy carrier and dropped the first American bombs on Tokyo. He'd come home to a Medal of Honor and a 2-grade promotion. He was the most famous aviator in America. MacArthur said no. He called Doolittle a showboat. What MacArthur needed wasn't a man who could make headlines. He needed a man who could fix something broken and do it without making it about himself. The man they sent instead was a 52-year-old general who had grown up in Massachusetts, fought as a fighter pilot in the First World War, and was currently commanding 4th Air Force out of California. No famous raids, no front-page photographs. His name had never appeared in a war dispatch that anyone outside the Army could name. George Kenney got the call on July 7, 1942. He packed his bag and left. On the flight out to Australia, Kenney sat with his aide, Major William Benn. They talked about a problem that had been sitting in the back of both their minds. The problem was simple to state and hard to solve. American aircraft had been attacking Japanese ships for months. High-altitude bombers, careful approaches, textbook runs. The results were close to nothing. A ship moving at sea, seen from 10,000 feet, has time to change course between the moment a bomb is released and the moment it hits the water. The math worked against every bomber in the Air Force inventory. Kenney and Ben were talking about what happened if you changed the math. What if you came in low, not 1,000 feet, not 550 feet wave height, so low the bomb had almost no time to fall. So low you dropped it, nearly flat, and it skipped across the water like a stone, and hit the ship below the waterline, the one place designed to be vulnerable. There was no doctrine for this, no training manual. No one in the United States military had ever done it at scale. It was just 2 men on an airplane doing arithmetic. Kenney landed in Brisbane on July 28th. The next morning, he walked into MacArthur's headquarters. What he found was not an air force. It was what was left of one. Most of the original Pacific Air Force had been destroyed in the Philippines in the first days after Pearl Harbor. What remained in Australia was worn out. undersupplied, and flying aircraft that were outmatched in almost every category by the Japanese Zero. The maintenance situation, by one account, was a swamp. Spare parts didn't arrive. Aircraft sat grounded for weeks. Pilots flew missions in planes that mechanics had kept together with whatever they could find. MacArthur had no confidence in any of it. He'd made that clear to both men who'd held the job before Kenney. He made it clear to Kenney, too, starting the morning after Kenney arrived. July 29, 1942. MacArthur's office, Brisbane. MacArthur sat down and began talking. He talked for half an hour without stopping. He went through the list. Everything the Air Force had failed to do since the war began. Failed to protect the Philippines. Failed to stop the Japanese advance across New Guinea. Failed to sink the convoys running troops and supplies down to Lae. Failed in one way or another at almost everything he'd been counting on air power to do. Kenney sat and listened. After half an hour, he stopped him. He wrote later, "I decided it was time for me to lay my cards on the table." He told MacArthur he wasn't interested in what had gone wrong before he arrived. He couldn't fix the past, and he wasn't going to try. What he could do was fix what was in front of him, if MacArthur was willing to let him do it his way. If MacArthur wanted someone who would follow orders and manage the mess, there were other names on the list. MacArthur looked at him for a moment. Then he put his hand on Kenney's shoulder. "I think we are going to get along all right." Kenney did not stay in Brisbane to read reports. Within days of that meeting, he was in New Guinea, walking airfields, talking to mechanics, sitting in on briefings with pilots who'd been flying combat missions for months and losing men they couldn't replace. He wanted to see the problem from where the problem actually lived. What he saw confirmed what he already suspected. Bombing ships from altitude didn't work. Not with the number of aircraft he had. Not against ships that had room to maneuver. The numbers from every mission report he'd read said the same thing. Less than 1% of bombs dropped from high altitude against moving ships actually hit their target. Less than 1%. He'd spent his career as a pilot. He understood what that meant in physical terms. A bomb dropped from 10,000 feet takes roughly 30 seconds to reach the water. In 30 seconds, a ship traveling at 15 knots moves 250 feet. The man releasing the bomb has to predict, before he releases it, exactly where the ship will be when the bomb arrives. Most of the time, he's wrong. Kenney looked at the problem and asked the question that the problem was pointing at. If the bomb can't reach the ship from up there, what happens if you bring it down here? The math was different at 50 feet. At 50 feet, a bomb dropped at speed had almost no time to fall. It left the aircraft nearly horizontal, hit the water and skipped, like a flat stone thrown across a lake. One skip, two skips. Then it hit the hull at the waterline. The one part of a ship that couldn't take that kind of hit without going under. The answer to the problem had been sitting in physics the whole time. Now someone had to go prove it. Major William Benn was not the kind of officer who waited for permission. He'd been talking about low-altitude bombing since before Kenney arrived, sketching it out on paper, arguing for it in briefings, trying to get someone to let him test it on something real. Kenney gave him that chance. He pulled Benn from staff work and sent him to the 63rd Bomb Squadron, 43rd Bomb Group, a unit that would become the laboratory for everything he was trying to build. Benn's assignment was simple. Take the idea, make it work, figure out what went wrong when it didn't, and do it fast, because the Japanese weren't waiting. The aircraft Ben had to work with was the B-17. Not a small airplane, not a nimble one. A 4-engine heavy bomber that weighed 30,000 pounds loaded, and was designed to drop its bombs from 25,000 feet. The idea of flying that airplane at 50 feet above the ocean, at full throttle, directly at a Japanese warship, was not something the men who designed it had ever considered. Ben considered it. On October 23, 1942, less than 3 months after Kenney had landed in Brisbane, Ben led the first successful skip bombing attack in the Pacific War. He brought his B-17 down to the water. He flew straight at the target. He dropped the bomb nearly flat. It skipped. It hit. The physics worked. But Ben had already seen the next problem. A B-17 flying at wave height toward a Japanese ship was a B-17 that every anti-aircraft gun on that ship could track, aim at, and fire on for the full length of the approach. At 50 feet there was nowhere to go, no altitude to trade for distance, no angle to break off. You were flying straight in. The gunners could see you coming from a long way out, and they had all the time they needed. You had to clear those gun crews off the deck before the bomb arrived. That problem was already being worked on by a man named Pappy Gunn. Paul Gunn had been a civilian pilot in the Philippines before the war, flying mail runs and cargo routes across the islands for nearly a decade. When the Japanese came, he stayed. He flew whatever the Army needed, in whatever condition the aircraft happened to be in. He was in his 40s. He had a wife and 4 children, still somewhere in the Philippines when they fell to the Japanese. He didn't talk about that. He worked. By the time Kenney arrived in Brisbane, Gunn had already been doing things to aircraft that no one at Wright Field had authorized and no technical manual had described. A Bell Aircraft factory representative who watched him work described him as able to do things with aircraft which others would not attempt. That was the polite version. Kenney recognized exactly what Gunn was. He put him in charge of special projects and told him to solve the deck clearing problem. What Gunn proposed was straightforward in concept and radical in execution. Strip out the bombardier's compartment in the nose of a B-25 Mitchell, the medium bomber that was faster and more maneuverable than anything Ben had been flying. Fill that space with 4.50 caliber machine guns firing straight ahead. Add 2 more in pods mounted on either side of the fuselage. 8 guns total, all pointing forward, all controlled by the pilot. When you came in on a ship at 50 feet, you fired before you dropped. The guns hit the deck first. The anti-aircraft crews went down before they could get their aim. Then the bomb followed. Kenney listened to the proposal. Then he told Gunn to build it. The first B-25 gun converted wouldn't fly. It was so nose-heavy from the added guns that it couldn't get off the ground. His crew named it Pappy's Folly. Gunn moved the wing pods further aft, shifted the fuel tank to bring the center of gravity back into range, took it up again. This time it flew. Over the following weeks, a full squadron of B-25s went through the same conversion. Gunn's team worked through every problem as it came up. Rivets popping from the muzzle blast, fuselage panels blowing in from the gun concussion, and fixed each one without stopping to file a report about it. Nobody was waiting for Washington to update the manual. By January of 1943, Kenney had the pieces in place. He had a proven technique. He had a weapon that could use it. He had pilots out on the reef at Port Moresby every afternoon, flying practice runs against a wrecked hulk in the water, getting better with every pass. He was ready. He just needed the right convoy to come along. And he didn't know yet that the man who'd laid the groundwork for all of it was about to disappear. January 18, 1943. Major William Benn took off from New Guinea on a mission. He didn't come back. No distress call. No wreckage found. The Army filed the paperwork, the way the Army filed all such paperwork. Missing in action. He was 33 years old. War has a particular kind of cruelty that doesn't get written about much. The man who works out the answer doesn't always live to see it used. Ben had spent months proving that this thing could work, that you could bring a large aircraft down to the water, drop a bomb at a ship's hull, and sink it. He was gone before the idea he proved ever had its proper test. The pilots who flew the technique 6 weeks later knew what they owed him. Most of the histories don't put his name in the story. January 5, 1943. 2 weeks before Ben disappeared, a Japanese convoy left Rabaul for the north coast of New Guinea. 5 transports, 5 destroyers, close to 10,000 soldiers. Kenney knew it was coming before it sailed. Allied codebreakers had been reading Japanese communications for months. He had the route, the departure date, the destination. He sent everything he had. Over 2 days, Allied aircraft flew 13 separate attack missions. 78% of the planes that launched reached their targets. 1 ship sank. The rest of the convoy reached its destination safely. Nearly 10,000 Japanese soldiers stepped off those ships with their equipment and supplies intact. Kenney opened his journal that night. He wrote one sentence: "We are taking it on the chin." In Rabaul, Vice Admiral Mikawa read the same outcome from the other direction. The convoy had gotten through, as they had been getting through, for months. He had no particular reason to reassess anything. The Americans had air power in the theater. That was known. They attacked convoys. That was expected. They sank a ship occasionally. The cost was manageable. The system worked. He began planning the next one. This time, Imperial headquarters wanted it larger. The garrison at Lae was running short of everything. Guadalcanal had just collapsed. New Guinea was now the line that had to hold. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, 6,900 soldiers from the 51st Division, and at Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura's request, the officer who would command the convoy, 100 fighter aircraft flying protective cover overhead. Kimura asked Mikawa about the air threat. Mikawa answered with the record. The Americans attacked convoys. Most of those convoys arrived. This one had better fighter cover than any of them. The convoy left Simpson Harbor at midnight, February 28th. What Kimura did not know, what no one in Rabaul knew, was that out on a reef outside Port Moresby, a squadron of B-25s had been flying practice runs every afternoon for 6 weeks. Coming in at wave height, 8 guns firing ahead, bombs dropping flat off the water. Kenney had gone out one day to watch. He stood on the ground and looked up at Major Ed Larner's squadron making pass after pass at the old wrecked hull. Every run clean, every bomb hitting where it was supposed to hit. He wrote, "They didn't miss. It was pretty shooting and pretty skip bombing." He had a feeling, he said later, that the enemy was going to get the surprise of their lives. Kimura's convoy was 2 days out of Rabaul when the weather broke. The first day had been overcast, low cloud, poor visibility. The kind of weather that had protected every convoy before this one. March 2nd. The sky cleared. Allied reconnaissance found them. B-17s came in from altitude. 1 transport went down. 2 were damaged. Kimura filed his report to Rabaul. Losses acceptable, still proceeding. He ordered the convoy to hold its course. There was no reason to change anything. The attack had come exactly as he expected. High altitude, predictable approach, manageable result. There was no reason to expect anything different. He was still thinking that when March 3rd arrived. March 3rd, 1943, morning. The Huon Gulf, off the northeast coast of New Guinea. Kimura's convoy was close now. Lae was a few hours ahead. The hard part was almost over. 100 Japanese fighters were circling above the convoy in slow, steady patterns. The anti-aircraft crews were at their stations. Every gun trained upward the way they'd always been trained, at the altitude where American bombers always came from. Radar picked up aircraft approaching from the southeast. Kimura looked toward the horizon. The first thing the lookout saw was wrong. Not wrong like an unexpected maneuver. Wrong like something that made no sense at all. The aircraft were not at altitude. They were at the water. Major Ed Larner's squadron of B-25s came in so low that the spray off the wave tops was visible from the ship's bridges. 50 feet above the surface, maybe less. moving at 300 miles an hour, straight toward the convoy, following the line where the sea met the air. 8 guns in the nose of each aircraft opened up before the ship's anti-aircraft crews understood what they were looking at. The .0 caliber rounds hit the deck of the nearest transport first, sweeping across it from bow to stern, before anyone on that ship had time to bring a weapon to bear. Then Larner dropped. The bomb left the aircraft nearly horizontal. It hit the water short of the transport's hull, skipped once, hit below the waterline. The explosion came up through the ship's belly. Larner pulled up hard through the smoke and the debris, and came out the other side still flying. Behind him, the rest of the squadron was already on its run. The anti-aircraft guns couldn't find them. The mounts were designed for targets at 2,000 feet and above. These aircraft were at 50. The guns couldn't depress far enough. The crews tried anyway. They traversed their barrels as low as the mounts would allow and fired into the empty space where the B-25s had been a half-second earlier. By the time the gun was pointing in the right direction, the aircraft was already past. 100 Japanese fighters were circling overhead. They couldn't come down either. Not into that space, not at those speeds, not without flying into their own ships. The P-38s above them were keeping them busy anyway, engaging the fighter screen while the B-25s worked below. Kimura watched from his bridge. He had no category for this, not in his training, not in his experience running convoys through these waters, not in any report he'd ever read about American air attacks on Japanese shipping. This had not existed before this morning. The coordinated attack came from 3 levels simultaneously. High above, B-17s coming down from altitude, drawing the eye upward, keeping the radar operators and the lookout split. Middle, more B-25s and A-20s, forcing the anti-aircraft guns to choose their angle. And at the water, Larner's squadron coming straight in at 50 feet, guns firing, bombs dropping flat. Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters ran ahead of the skip bombers, lower and faster than anything else in the air, strafing the gun positions on every ship they passed. By the time the B-25s were on their final approach, the decks of the target ships had already been swept. There was nothing left to fire back. The first transport rolled and began to sink. Then the second. The third took a hit below the waterline and slowed, listing hard to port, then stopped moving altogether as the water came in faster than anything could stop it. Kimura was sending damage reports to Rabaul as fast as they came in. The reports were getting harder to send. His own ship was maneuvering to avoid aircraft now, turning hard, trying to put its stern toward the attackers, trying to give the guns a better angle. There was no better angle. The attack came from the water. Every defensive calculation his crews had trained for assumed the attack came from the sky. By midday, 4 transports were gone. The attacks continued through the afternoon, wave after wave, coming in from different directions at different altitudes, in rotating sequences that gave the gun crews no time to reset between passes. Kimura's destroyers were maneuvering hard, trying to cover what remained of the transports, trying to pick up men from the water between attacks. A destroyer took a hit and slowed, then another. The convoy that had left Rabaul 8 days earlier, as the strongest Japanese resupply effort of the New Guinea campaign, was coming apart in the Huon Gulf, under a form of air attack that none of the men aboard had ever encountered or been trained to defend against. March 4th. The attacks continued into the following day. PT boats came in at night, moving through the debris field and the men in the water, finishing what the aircraft had started. When it was over, 8 transports, gone, 4 destroyers, gone. Of the 6,900 soldiers who had left Rabaul bound for Leh, roughly 1,200 made it ashore. The rest were in the Huon Gulf. American losses for the 3-day battle: 6 aircraft, 13 men. In Rabaul, Vice Admiral Mikawa received the final accounting. There is no record of what he said in the room that day. No account from anyone who was present. No entry in any diary that has been recovered. What exists is the message he sent to Tokyo a few hours after the last report came in. He wrote it himself. It is certain that the success obtained by the American Air Force in this battle dealt a fatal blow to the South Pacific. Not a statement for the record. Not a way of managing expectations upward. This was a man who understood naval warfare, writing down exactly what he believed in the clearest language he had. A fatal blow, not a setback, not a costly engagement, not a battle that needed to be analyzed before conclusions were drawn. He knew what had happened. He knew it couldn't be undone. He said so plainly. Captain Tamichi Hara commanded one of the destroyers that survived the 3 days. He had been in the Imperial Japanese Navy for over 2 decades. He had fought at Guadalcanal. He had run the Tokyo Express down the slot on missions that cost ships and men, and came back anyway. He was not a man who used the word unbelievable about much. He used it about this. Japan's defeat there was unbelievable, he wrote years later. Never was there such a debacle. Here is what didn't happen after the battle. Imperial headquarters did not issue an order saying, "Do not send convoys in daylight." There was no memorandum, no formal change of doctrine, no meeting that anyone recorded where someone said out loud, "We cannot do this anymore." What happened instead was simpler and in some harder to look at directly. April came. No large convoy crossed the Bismarck Sea in daylight. May none, June none. Through the rest of 1943, into 1944, until the end of the war, Japan never again sent a major supply convoy through open water in daylight in a theater where Kenney's aircraft were operating. What replaced the convoys were barges. Small, shallow draft barges that crept along the coastline of New Britain after dark, staying close to the shore, moving in the hours when the B-25s and A-20s couldn't see them. Many of those barges were found anyway. The Japanese answer to what Kenney had done was not a statement, not a press conference, not an acknowledgement of any kind. It was a change in behavior so complete that it spoke louder than anything Mikawa wrote. They knew. They just couldn't say it. The day the last ships went down in the Huon Gulf, Kenney was already on a plane to Washington. The meeting had been scheduled for weeks before the convoy ever left Rabaul. He hadn't known when he'd agreed to go that the timing would fall the way it did. He stopped in Hawaii first. He sat down with Nimitz and walked him through the numbers. 12 ships, nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers lost. 6 American aircraft, 13 men. Nimitz read the figures slowly. Then he looked up and asked one question. "How many planes did we lose?" Kenney said 6. Nimitz didn't say anything more. He let Kenney continue on to Washington. In the briefing rooms and the hallways of the War Department, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was received as good news, which it was. MacArthur issued a statement. The press ran the story. Kenney's name appeared in a few of the dispatches. Arnold and Marshall were pleased. But in those rooms, among the men who ran the American war effort from behind desks in Washington, D.C., no one asked the question that would have unlocked what the battle actually meant. No one asked, "What changes now?" Not because they were careless, because the battle, from where they sat, looked like a larger version of other battles they'd already absorbed and moved past. Air power had destroyed a convoy. That was good. What was next? The men in those rooms were managing a war on 2 oceans simultaneously. They were thinking about North Africa, the Pacific logistics chain, the schedule for the European invasion. They filed the Bismarck Sea under victory and moved on. What they didn't see, what almost no one in Washington saw that spring, was the second-order consequence sitting underneath the numbers. Kenney had not just sunk 12 ships. He had demonstrated, in conditions that could not be argued with, that a properly equipped and trained Air Force could deny Japan the ability to move troops and supplies by sea in daylight, anywhere within range of land-based aircraft, and that range was growing. Every time MacArthur's forces moved forward along the New Guinea coast, Lae, Finschhafen, Hollandia, Wacht, Biak, the airfields moved with them. And as the airfields moved, the zone where Japanese ships could not travel in daylight moved with them too. Rabaul, the fortress that had anchored the entire Japanese position in the Southwest Pacific, sat at the center of that zone. Not because it had been captured, not because it had been defeated in battle, because it could no longer receive what it needed to survive. 100,000 Japanese soldiers dug into tunnels and bunkers on that island, waiting for an American assault that never came, rationing food that was no longer arriving, watching the war move past them toward the Philippines, toward the home islands, toward the end. MacArthur walked around Rabaul without firing a shot. That decision, which historians still call one of the most efficient strategic moves of the entire Pacific War, rested on a foundation that Kenney had built in a practice field outside Port Moresby, flying passes at a wrecked ship on a reef, 6 weeks before anyone had heard of the Bismarck Sea. Kenney came home from Washington in March of 1943. He went back to work. The war in New Guinea was not finished. The Japanese garrison at Lae was still there. The advance up the coast had barely started. There were missions every day, convoys to find and hit, airfields to suppress, supply lines to cut. He did not stop to write about what had happened at the Bismarck Sea, as if it were a turning point. He was already past it. Major Ed Larner, who had led the first skip bombing runs on March 3rd, whose squadron had made what the records describe as a flawless first pass, flew missions for another 2 months. He was alive when most of the news about the battle was still being written. April 30th, 1943, 57 days after the Bismarck Sea. Larner brought his B-25 in to land at Dobadura the way he always did it, diving low over the field, pulling up sharp at the end. It was a move the other pilots recognized, his trademark. That day, his aircraft was carrying a full crew and passengers. He pulled up and the plane stalled. It went into a flat spin. It hit the ground and burned. No one survived. He left behind a wife and 2 daughters. He was 25 years old. Major William Benn, the man who had worked out the mathematics of this thing on a flight from Washington to Brisbane 8 months earlier. The man who had taken a 4-engine heavy bomber down to wave height and proved it could be done. The man whose name appears in almost none of the standard accounts of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, had been listed as missing in action since January 18th. He was 33. Neither man lived to read what Captain Tamichi Hara wrote about March 3rd in the memoir he published after the war. Hara spent more pages on that day than most American histories devote to Kenney's entire career. He wrote it from the deck of a destroyer that survived. He wrote about watching the B-25s come in at the water, about the guns firing ahead of the bombs, about the way the bombs skipped, about not having any way to stop it. Never was there such a debacle, he wrote. Japan's defeat there was unbelievable. Sometimes the clearest account of what you did comes from the man you did it to. After the war, Kenney wrote his memoir. He called it General Kenney Reports. He wrote it the way he did everything, direct, unadorned, without much sentiment. He described the campaigns, the aircraft, the decisions, the men he'd worked with, and the ones he'd lost. MacArthur mentioned him in his own memoir a few times. There is no airport named after Kenney, no statue outside the Air Force Academy, no film with his name in the title. The modified B-25, the aircraft Pappy gun built without permission, the one Washington tried to ground before it ever flew in combat, went on to be used across the Pacific for the rest of the war. North American aviation eventually incorporated versions of the modification into later production models. The technique Ben proved in October of 1942 became standard doctrine for Allied air forces in every theater where ships needed sinking. Go back to January of 1943 for a moment. Two men, reading the same report, 500 miles apart. One of them folded the paper and stepped outside. The system was working. There was nothing to reassess. One of them opened his journal and wrote, "We are taking it on the chin." Then he went back to work. 6 weeks later, the man who had folded the paper sat down and wrote the most honest sentence anyone on the Japanese side wrote about the air war in the Pacific. A fatal blow. He didn't say who had delivered it. He didn't name Kenney. He didn't describe the aircraft or the technique or the men who'd built it. He didn't have to. The convoy that left Rabaul in February of 1943 was the last one of its kind. That fact said everything Mikawa's sentence left out. If your father served in the Pacific, or your grandfather, or anyone in your family who came back from those years and didn't say much about them. I want to ask you something. Was there a name he mentioned once? A place he referred to in a way that made the room go quiet. A moment at the dinner table when he started a sentence and then didn't finish it. Those things don't make it into the official record. The after-action reports have the numbers. The histories have the strategy. But the thing your father carried home, whatever it was he kept in the part of himself he didn't open up for company, that only exists in you now. Leave it in the comments. It doesn't have to be a full story. A name, a unit, an island. Something he said once that you've never forgotten. Because the day the last person who remembers him is gone, that's the day he's really gone. And that day doesn't have to come yet.
The most basic concept of survival for the United States Navy's submarine force in the early years of the Second World War was encapsulated in a single unwritten rule. When you spot an Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer, dive deep and pray. Destroyers were apex surface predators designed specifically to crush the steel hulls of submarines. They possessed a superior speed of up to 35 knots, highly sensitive sonar systems, and depth charge racks carrying devastating payloads. A direct confrontation between a slow-moving submarine and a heavily armed destroyer was universally regarded by military tacticians as an act of suicide. The history of the Pacific Theater from 1941 to early 1944 was defined by the relentless persecution of the silent service. But at a submarine base in the Southwest Pacific in the spring of 1944, a bloody paradigm shift was about to begin. The Gato-class fleet submarine designated SS-257, the USS Harder, was moored for refueling and rearmament. Commanding the boat was Commander Samuel Dealey. He was a 38-year-old officer with chiseled features and eyes that betrayed a cold, calculating nature. Up to this point, the Harder had sent 9 Japanese merchant vessels to the bottom, 9 white tally marks painted on her conning tower. It was a respectable figure, but not the stuff of legend. Slow-moving tankers could not fight back. They were mere pawns on the oceanic chessboard. However, the entire landscape of the undersea war was permanently altered on April 12, 1944. While patrolling beneath the surface around the Caroline Islands, the Harder's radio room received a decrypted message from Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, had issued an order that overturned years of core operational doctrine. The dispatch completely lifted the ban on engaging enemy escort vessels. Lockwood declared his intent with a chilling directive. The time had come to tear down the destroyer screens. Inside the cramped control room, heavy with the stench of diesel fuel and stale sweat, Samuel Dealey read the dispatch under the red rig for dark lighting. He did not say a word, There was no cheering or excitement among the officers present. The decision was made in absolute silence. The Mark 14 torpedoes in the forward torpedo room were ordered for immediate gyrocompass alignment checks. The USS Harder began to alter her course, deliberately heading straight into the notorious patrol routes of the Japanese Navy. 7 p.m. on April 13th. The Pacific sky was fading into a pale twilight. The sea state was calm. The bridge lookout on the Harder spotted a faint trail of black smoke stretching across the horizon. The optical rangefinder initially established the distance at 15,000 yards. The target was closing at high speed. Identification through the periscope confirmed it was the Ikazuchi, a veteran Fubuki-class destroyer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The warship boasted a displacement of nearly 2,000 tons, armed with 6 5-inch naval guns and a massive arsenal of depth charges lined along her aft deck. The Ikazuchi was no sluggish transport. She was a dedicated killer that had participated in countless bloody campaigns since the very first shots were fired at Pearl Harbor. The radar screen on the Harder flickered relentlessly. The return signal indicated that the lookouts on the Ikazuchi had already spotted the American boat. A massive white bow wave erupted from the front of the destroyer as she executed a hard turn. She was aiming her steel bow directly at the submarine's coordinates to prepare for a ramming maneuver or to deliver a barrage of depth charges. According to the standard reflexes drilled during thousands of hours at the Annapolis Naval Academy, this was the exact moment a commanding officer would scream the order to crash dive. The klaxon would howl. The main ballast tank vents would be thrown open, allowing seawater to flood in and drag the hull down to a safe depth. 15 seconds before the first depth charges detonated, but Samuel Dealey stood perfectly still next to the primary periscope housing. His hands gripped the grease-coated brass handles. His eyes remained glued to the optics without blinking. He ordered the diving officer to maintain current depth. The 2,400-ton steel hull of the Harder hovered just beneath the waves, exposing only the fragile optical tube cutting through the dark water. Inside the conning tower, the silence was so absolute that one could clearly hear the ragged breathing of the plainsman. The temperature inside the steel pressure hull spiked to over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, but no one noticed. All attention was entirely focused on the torpedo data computer operator. Complex mechanical gears clicked continuously, calculating the target's track angle, speed, and range. Through the hydrophones, the sonar man reported the cold, rhythmic pinging echoing through the hull. It was the active sonar of the Ikazuchi hunting for their steel casing. The high-pitched whine of the destroyer's triple-blade propellers grew louder by the second, roaring through the thin pressure hull. The sound reverberated against their eardrums like an electric freight train barreling into a closed room. The range dropped to 5,000 yards. The Ikazuchi loomed massive and lethal in the periscope lens. 3,000 yards. The deck guns on the Japanese warship had begun to depress, scanning the surface for a target. 1,500 yards. It was far too late to dive and escape. The Harder was now locked in an irreversible death spiral. Either they destroyed the enemy, or all 80 men would be crushed by thousands of tons of water pressure at the bottom of the abyss. 1859 hours. The distance from the periscope to the enemy's bow was exactly 900 yards, an incredibly extreme and suicidal range in naval warfare. This distance was known among submariners by a bloody moniker, the down-the-throat shot. Dealey stepped back from the periscope. His voice rang out in the dry, sterile air of the control room, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. The submarine's steel structure shuddered violently with each press of the firing button. Compressed air forced 4 torpedoes, each weighing over 3,000 pounds, out of the forward tubes. Their counter-rotating propellers tore through the water, leaving 4 distinct wakes of white foam on the dark sea, heading straight for the bow of the charging destroyer. The officer of the deck on the Ikazuchi saw the white wakes of death approaching in the twilight. The helm was ordered hard over in a state of absolute desperation. The massive ship listed heavily to port, but her immense physical mass could not outmaneuver the 30-knot speed of the intercepting torpedoes. 10 seconds after leaving the tubes, 2 of the 4 torpedoes slammed into the side of the Ikazuchi. A deafening explosion shattered the surface of the Caroline Sea. A column of water shot dozens of feet into the air, carrying jagged, red-hot shrapnel with it. The massive payload of Torpex explosive blew a catastrophic hole deep below the destroyer's waterline. Seawater flooded violently into the lower engine rooms. The central boiler system detonated due to the sudden temperature drop, creating a secondary shockwave that completely broke the ship's back. There was no time to launch lifeboats. No abandoned ship order could be broadcast over the public address system. The colossal steel beast rolled over and plunged into the dark ocean in less than 5 minutes. The Ikazuchi was wiped off the map, taking her entire crew down to a bottomless grave. Aboard the USS Harder, the suffocating silence gave way to stunned stares in the control room. They had just achieved the impossible. They had turned a bloodthirsty apex predator into a helpless victim in the blink of an eye. But for Commander Samuel Dealey, sinking the Ikazuchi was not the end of a campaign. The smell of cordite and the sound of rending metal under water pressure seemed to have awakened a dangerous primal instinct within this stoic commander. The hunt had just begun. Immediately, the boat was ordered to change course. Navigational charts were unrolled. The submarine laid in a course straight for the East Indies, heading toward the heavily armored anchorage of the Japanese combined fleet. At the Tawi-Tawi Fleet anchorage, surrounded by the most advanced destroyers, the USS Harder would voluntarily enter a far more brutal wager. A dark chapter was about to unfold, one that would not only shake the entire paradigm of the undersea war, but would test the absolute limits of both steel machinery and the human nervous system until they shattered. The waters of the East Indies in early June 1944 were not a forgiving place, particularly the Tawi-Tawi anchorage, the massive fortified staging ground of the Japanese combined fleet. The naval forces of the Empire were gathering here in preparation for a strategic, decisive naval battle in the Philippine Sea. Around the islands loomed the dark silhouettes of colossal battleships. Their defensive perimeter was tightly secured by dozens of elite destroyers. Any lone submarine wandering into these waters was effectively signing its own death warrant. But the USS Harder had not wandered in by mistake. Under the command of Samuel Dealey, the boat was actively prowling right at the gates of hell. The night of June 6th, the sea was eerily calm. The black steel hull of the Harder sliced quietly through the surface waters on patrol to recharge her electric batteries. The radar screen suddenly bloomed with interference. The sonar shack reported propeller noises from a slow-moving convoy heading south, consisting of 3 empty oil tankers and 2 escorting destroyers. Dealey immediately ordered flank speed on the surface. He intended to maneuver the Harder ahead of the enemy formation to establish a perfect ambush position. The massive diesel engines roared, pushing the boat through the darkness. But the elements betrayed them. A perfectly full moon slowly rose above the eastern horizon, casting a cold, silvery light over the dark ocean. The seawater-drenched hull of the Harder instantly caught the moonlight, turning the boat into a glowing slab of metal in the open sea. Immediately, the lookouts on the destroyer Minazuki spotted the target. Without a second of hesitation, the Minazuki broke from the tanker escort formation. Her razor-sharp bow cleaved the waves, engines throttling up to maximum speed to execute a direct ramming maneuver meant to crush the American submarine. The atmosphere inside the Harder's control room froze once again. The diving klaxon remained silent. Instead of frantically fleeing or diving deep to the ocean floor, Samuel Dealey made a decision that was ruthless in its cold calculation. He ordered the propeller revolutions reduced to a bare minimum, causing the boat to crawl like a ghost. Then the rudder was put hard over. The submarine swung laterally, exposing its fragile broadside before slowly bringing its fore-aft torpedo tubes to bear directly on the charging Minazuki. It was an apocalyptic game of chicken. Dealey was engaging in a psychological test of nerves with the Japanese warship commander. He waited. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The Minazuki grew massive in the optical lens. White water boiled up from the destroyer's bow, carrying terrifying mechanical momentum. If the torpedoes missed, that thousands of tons of steel would bisect the Harder. If Dealey ordered a dive at this range, the 15 seconds required to flood the ballast tanks would be far too slow. The depth charges would be dropped squarely on the conning tower. 9:59 p.m. The distance had been closed to an extreme limit. The sweltering heat radiating from the electronic systems mixed with the cold sweat on the brows of the plotting officers. Only when the dark silhouette of the Minazuki completely filled the circular reticle did Dealey's dry voice cut through the silence. Fire all aft tubes. 3 torpedoes tore through the still waters of the Tawi-Tawi Sea. The point-blank range rendered the Japanese warship's evasive capabilities completely useless. 2 torpedoes smashed directly into the center of the Minazuki's hull. The explosive force of thousands of pounds of torpex ignited a massive, brilliant fireball in the moonlit night. A towering column of water collapsed downward, breaking the destroyer's spine. Buried beneath the endless cacophony of rending, shattering metal were the screams of hundreds of burning sailors. But the ocean did not grant Dealey any time to celebrate. Before the Minazuki had even fully slipped beneath the waves, the Harder's radar howled with deafening intensity. Capitalizing on the illumination from the explosion, the second destroyer, named Wakatsuki, had pinpointed their exact location and was charging in at a frenzied speed to exact revenge. Once again, Dealey did not back down. The blood of the hunt was boiling in his veins. He held his position, waiting for the Wakatsuki to enter the crosshairs before unleashing all 6 forward torpedoes. 10:42 p.m. The torpedoes left their tubes racing forward, but this time the captain of the Wakatsuki was prepared. The ship executed a spectacular, hard turn, slipping past all 6 white wakes of death by a mere fraction of a margin. The gates of hell swung wide open for the crew of the USS Harder. There were no torpedoes loaded in the tubes. A furious destroyer was bearing down on them from a distance measured in mere hundreds of yards. Crash dive. The order was barked out. The klaxon tore through the silence. The main ballast vents were thrown completely open. The boat pitched forward at a steep, violent angle, 90 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet. But the Wakatsuki was already directly overhead. The roar of her propellers pierced the steel hull like the grinding teeth of a colossal mechanical beast. And then the depth charges began to fall. The entire Tawi-Tawi Sea felt as if it were being violently lifted by tectonic fractures originating from the ocean floor. Massive shock waves ripped through the water, slamming directly into the submarine's pressure hull. The USS Harder was violently thrown upward. and then slammed back, down like a tin toy. At a depth of 300 feet, the external water pressure reached terrifying levels. Every square inch of the steel hull had to endure the crushing weight of tons of water. Light bulbs across all compartments shattered simultaneously. Thick darkness swallowed the 80 men whole. High-pressure valves hissed and screamed. The rivets on the bulkheads began to crack, and freezing seawater, heavy with the smell of brine, sprayed forcefully like knives into the engine room. Cork insulation rained down from the ceiling onto the heads of the sailors who lay clinging desperately to the rusting deck plates. They were waiting for the next barrel of explosives to land squarely on the conning tower, which would permanently turn this vessel into a sealed, armored coffin. It was a nightmare that lasted for hours, draining their physical endurance and completely eroding the boundaries of their sanity. By some miracle of mechanical engineering and sheer unadulterated luck, the Harder's steel hull held. They slipped through the cold thermoclines deep beneath the sea and managed to lose the Wakatsuki by the narrowest of margins. But that suffocating escape did not deter Samuel Dealey. Despite the structural fatigue of the mechanical systems and the severely depleted oxygen levels, just one day later, he threw the boat back into the crucible. Dealey allowed the destroyer Hayanami to close to within 650 yards before blowing it out of the water with a magazine explosion so catastrophic that the resulting shockwave nearly capsized the submarine itself. 3 days later, in the ultimate display of madness, Dealey engaged 2 destroyers simultaneously, sinking the Tanakaze with shots fired at point-blank range. In the span of a mere 4 days, 3 cutting-edge destroyers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were obliterated in direct, head-to-head duels. A bloody, glorious track record and entirely unprecedented in the history of naval warfare. But behind the cold, clinical action, reports cabled back to Submarine Command, a silent tragedy was unfolding inside the steel hull of the Harder. The burden of constantly dragging 80 lives across the razor-thin line between survival and annihilation was destroying Samuel Dealey's nervous system. The archives of the United States Navy still hold a detailed report handwritten by his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Frank Lynch. The ink recorded a reality that the wartime propaganda machine always sought to conceal. Lynch observed that his captain was beginning to exhibit unmistakable signs of severe combat fatigue. Dealey became abnormally indifferent to and reckless with the most basic maritime safety protocols. He ignored Japanese anti-submarine countermeasures. Worse still, there were moments right in the climax of an attack where Lynch saw Dealey fall into a state of mute paralysis, his eyes vacant, completely incapable of making vital operational decisions. The long days exposing himself to the depth, charge barrages at Tawi-Tawi, the sound of steel fracturing under deep-sea pressure, combined with the crushing weight of maintaining the title of destroyer killer, had hollowed out this commander from the inside. His physical body still stood on the bridge, but his mind seemed to have been swallowed by the darkness of the ocean. A man of flesh and blood was slowly disintegrating under the heavy weight of a medal. At 5:32 on the morning of August 24, 1944, the sonar operator aboard the American submarine USS Harder pressed his headphones tightly against his ears. Through the static of the deep water, he detected the distinct rhythmic thrashing of bronze propellers cutting through the ocean. 15 violent depth charge explosions followed shortly after, tearing through the acoustic channels of the Philippine Sea. When the shockwaves finally faded into the vast emptiness of the Pacific, absolute silence returned. It was a profound, suffocating silence. It was the last sound the world would ever hear from Commander Samuel Dealey and the 80 men of the USS Harder. To understand the anatomy of this final tragedy, one must rewind to the docks of Fremantle, Australia, 3 weeks earlier. The USS Harder had returned from the nightmare of the Tawi anchorage. The boat was physically battered, and her crew was psychologically exhausted. Naval regulations dictated that Samuel Dealey be relieved of command to recover from severe combat fatigue. Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, noticing the vacant stares and the trembling hands of his top submarine ace, had actually drafted the paperwork to transfer command to Dealey's executive officer. But Dealey vehemently refused. He argued with the admiral, insisting he needed to lead one final patrol to shepherd a newly formed submarine wolf pack. The high command, blinded by the aura of the destroyer killer, made a fatal concession. They allowed a man whose nerves were entirely frayed to step back onto the bridge of a war machine. On August 5th, the Harder slipped her moorings, accompanied by the submarines USS Hake and USS Harder. They formed a wolf pack operating under Dealey's direct tactical command. Their destination was the South China Sea, specifically the perilous waters off the coast of the Philippines, a vital maritime artery for the retreating Japanese Empire. The early days of the patrol were marked by ruthless efficiency. On August 21st, the American wolf pack intercepted a Japanese convoy in Palawan Bay. They devastated the enemy formation, sending 4 merchant ships to the bottom. The next evening, the Harder independently sank 2 coastal defense frigates. 24 hours later, the USS Hake crippled the Japanese destroyer Asakaze. By the early morning hours of August 24th, the Harder and the Hake had rendezvoused off Dassault Bay. They were operating on the surface, hunting for the crippled Asakaze, unaware that the Japanese destroyer had already sunk hours earlier. The pre-dawn light was just beginning to bleed over the horizon. The sea was draped in a thick gray mist. At exactly 5:32, radar screens on both American submarines picked up incoming surface contacts from the southeast. Through the powerful optical binoculars on the bridge, 2 distinct silhouettes emerged from the fog. One was a large warship, the other was a smaller, highly maneuverable escort vessel. The larger ship presented a bizarre and chilling irony of naval warfare. Through the periscope, the officers on the USS Hake identified the vessel as Patrol Boat 102 of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But its silhouette was unmistakably American. It was a Clemson-class 4-stack destroyer. This ship was originally the USS Stuart, an American warship that had been heavily damaged and scuttled in a dry dock in Java in 1942. The Japanese had salvaged her, repaired her hull, mounted their own deck guns, and turned the ghost of an American warship against its former masters. Escorting this captured prize was the Kaiboken CD-22. Unlike the massive, lumbering destroyers Dealey had faced before, a Kaiboken was a dedicated subchaser. It was small, incredibly nimble, and designed with a shallow draft specifically to hunt submarines in coastal waters. It was the absolute worst type of vessel to engage in a head-on torpedo duel. At 6:32, Patrol Boat 102 abruptly altered course, peeling away toward the safety of the bay. This maneuver left the agile CD-22 entirely alone, heading on a direct interception course with the 2 American submarines. Lieutenant Commander Frank Haler, the captain of the USS Hawk, evaluated the tactical geometry and realized the severe disadvantage. The water was shallow. The enemy was highly maneuverable and completely alerted. Haler made the textbook decision. He ordered the Hake to crash dive, taking his boat deep to evade the incoming subchaser. As the Hake slipped beneath the waves, Haler took one final look through his attack periscope. He expected to see the Harder diving right alongside him. Instead, what he saw sent a chill down his spine. The periscope shears of the USS Harder were still slicing through the surface water. Samuel Dealey had not ordered a dive. Once again, driven by a shattered nervous system and an addictive reliance on fatal gambles, Dealey was turning his boat's bow directly toward the charging enemy. He was setting up for another down-the-throat shot. But the CD-22 was not a sluggish transport, nor was it a heavy destroyer struggling to alter its momentum. As the Harder closed the distance and fired 3 torpedoes from her forward tubes, the captain of the Japanese subchaser saw the wakes. With a hard over of the rudder, the small, agile vessel danced out of the way. All 3 heavy torpedoes sailed harmlessly past its hull. Dealey's luck had finally run out. He had brought a knife to a gunfight, and he had missed his only thrust. The CD-22 immediately pounced. The subchaser accelerated directly over the Harder's position. The Japanese crew systematically rolled a devastating pattern of heavy depth charges off their stern racks. Aboard the Hake, submerged miles away, the crew listened in horror as the ocean erupted. 15 distinct catastrophic detonations hammered against their hull like the strikes of a sledgehammer. The sheer concussive force indicated that the depth charges had found their mark with pinpoint accuracy. When the Hake finally surfaced hours later, the sea was empty. There was no debris. There was no oil slick. There was only the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Commander Haler transmitted repeated radio calls on all encrypted frequencies. No response ever came. For weeks, the High Command held on to a desperate hope. But as the silence stretched into the autumn of 1944, the USS Harder was officially declared overdue and presumed lost with all hands. The resting place of this legendary submarine remained a total mystery for 8 decades. It was not until the year 2024 that the deep sea exploration team of the Lost 52 project finally located the wreck. The USS Harder lies in the crushing darkness at a depth of nearly 3,000 feet. High-resolution sonar scans revealed a haunting truth. The submarine sits upright on her keel, looking almost entirely intact, as if ready to resume her patrol. But just behind the conning tower, there is a single catastrophic hole punched straight through the pressure hull. A fatal wound delivered by a Japanese depth charge that instantly flooded the control room, dragging 80 men to the bottom before they even had time to realize they were dying. The official records of the United States Navy honor Samuel Dealey with the posthumous award of the Medal of Honor, the supreme recognition for his unprecedented wartime achievements. But the internal debriefings of the Pacific Fleet harbor a much darker narrative. The USS Harder and her entire crew should never have been ordered to undertake that 6th patrol. According to standard wartime medical protocols, after 5 consecutive combat patrols besieged by hundreds of depth charges, every submarine commander was required to be rotated ashore. The archives still retain the original report from Dealey's executive officer, clearly documenting that the captain had descended into a state of psychological shock, his reflexes sluggish, completely disregarding minimum safety protocols. But the command structure capitulated. They yielded to the combat hunger of a single individual, and they yielded to the radiant halo surrounding the title of Destroyer Killer. When Dealey made the decision to remain at periscope depth and stubbornly point his torpedo tubes directly at a Japanese anti-submarine vessel off the coast of Palawan, instead of diving deep to evade, it was not a stroke of tactical genius. It was, in all likelihood, the final symptom of a nervous system that had been stretched until it snapped. 18 months of living in the dark, subjected to the crushing pressure of the ocean floor, had entirely eroded his basic instinct for survival. No marble monuments have been erected at those coordinates in the South China Sea. 80 men of flesh and blood paid the ultimate price for the exhaustion of a command system that refused to see the human breaking point. They rest quietly with their boat in the abyss, leaving behind a monumental legacy and a bitter lesson about the absolute limits of human endurance in the theater of war. Imagine this scene. It is the early morning of May 31st, 1944. Somewhere in the vast black waters of the South Pacific, between Manus and Truk, for 30 long, exhausting hours, 3 American destroyers had been locked in a brutal game of cat and mouse with one determined Japanese submarine, the RO-105. 21 attacks, depth charges rolling off the decks, hedgehog mortars screaming into the sea, wave after wave, and still, that submarine would not die. The USS George and the USS Raby had been at it for most of the night. They had even forced her to the surface once. But that Japanese captain, he was a master of evasion. He kept positioning his boat perfectly between the 2 destroyers, blocking their lines of fire, stealing just enough time to dive again and again. The American crews were exhausted, their nerves were frayed, ammunition was running low, the frustration hung heavy in the air. Then, a new voice crackled over the radio. It was the USS England, closing in fast from the southwest. One of the other captains responded immediately. "We're not telling you where we are. We've got a damaged sub here, and by God, we're going to sink him ourselves." You could hear the determination in his voice. 3 ships, 30 hours of relentless pursuit, and no one wanted to share the glory. But Commander Hamilton Haines knew exactly what he had in the England. At precisely 7:29 in the morning, the England moved into position, one clean approach, one perfectly timed salvo from her forward hedgehog mount, and then 6 to 10 hits, striking almost simultaneously, a tremendous underwater explosion that shook the England from stem to stern. In a matter of seconds, it was over. The RO-105, gone. 1 shot, 1 kill. This was not merely another submarine sinking, this was the most brutal, most decisive hedgehog attack of the entire Second World War. And today, we will explore the full story. How a brand-new destroyer escort, fresh to the fight, with almost no combat experience, became the deadliest submarine hunter in the Pacific in just 12 days. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is the stuff of legend. To understand the full magnitude of that single devastating attack, we must first step back to the strategic situation facing the Imperial Japanese Navy in May 1944. Following the American capture of the Marshall Islands earlier that year, Japanese High Command was forced to anticipate the next Allied thrust. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, weighed 2 dangerous possibilities: an advance west toward the Palaus in the Caroline Islands, or northwest into the Mariana Islands themselves. To gather vital intelligence on American fleet movements, Toyota ordered Submarine Squadron 7 into the waters south of the Caroline Islands. Their mission was threefold: conduct long-range patrols, perform reconnaissance, and stand ready to launch surprise attacks against any enemy task forces that appeared. It was in this tense and critical sector of the Pacific that the USS England and her division were operating. The England was a Buckley-class escort destroyer, hull numbered DE-635. Commissioned at the end of 1943, she formed part of Escort Division 39 alongside her sister ships, the George and the Raby. The division operated under the overall command of Commander Hamilton Haines. These 3 vessels had seen relatively quiet duty in the opening months of their wartime service. Routine convoy escorts and transport runs across the Southwest and Central Pacific had occupied their days. Yet every officer and enlisted man aboard understood their true purpose. The ships had been specially equipped and rigorously trained for anti-submarine warfare. Their crews were eager, almost impatient, for the chance to prove what they could do. The commanding officer of the England was Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, a steady and experienced leader. But the man who would shape the ship's destiny in the coming days was her executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson. Williamson had served previously in the Atlantic Theater. There he had witnessed firsthand the lethal danger posed by German U-boats. Determined that the England would never be found wanting, he had drilled the crew relentlessly for month after month. Every conceivable anti-submarine scenario was practiced until it became second nature. Sonar tracking, approach angles, depth charge patterns, and above all, the precise employment of their most advanced weapon. That weapon was the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, Mark X. Mounted forward of the bridge, it represented a revolutionary advance in underwater warfare. Instead of rolling depth charges off the stern that exploded at preset depths, the Hedgehog fired a spread of 24 small mortar bombs in a fixed pattern ahead of the ship. Each bomb was fitted with a contact fuse. It would explode only upon striking a solid surface, such as a submarine's hull. This single design change dramatically improved the odds of success. Traditional depth charge attacks succeeded roughly once in every 80 attempts. The Hedgehog achieved a kill ratio closer to 1 in 5. When the 24 bombs arced through the air and entered the sea together, they formed a lethal pattern that looked for all the world like an angry hedgehog firing its quills. The England's crew had mastered this weapon through endless drills. Now they waited for the moment when theory would become reality. Before we return to the Pacific in May 1944, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, World of Warships Legends. Legends is a free-to-play naval combat game for consoles that lets you command more than 400 historic warships from 11 nations. With intuitive controls and battles ranging from 9 versus 9 to intense 3-on-3 brawls, strategy and positioning matter as much as reflexes. This summer's American-themed update brings the return of the legendary hybrid battleship Louisiana, along with fresh content and new ships to unlock. Use the link in the description to join over 8 million players and experience naval warfare like never before. On May 18, 1944, decrypted Japanese signals revealed that submarine Y-16 had been ordered to make a supply run to the beleaguered garrison on Bougainville. Escort Division 39 was immediately dispatched from their base at Port Purvis with clear orders: intercept and destroy the enemy submarine. The stage was now set for the England and her crew to write their name into history. The test came sooner than anyone expected. On the morning of May 19, 1944, the 3 ships of Escort Division 39 were closing on the projected track of the Japanese submarine Western 16. Shortly before 1400 hours, the England's sonar operator reported a strong contact dead ahead at close range. Lieutenant Commander Pendleton immediately ordered an attack run with the forward Hedgehog. The first salvo produced no explosions. The second also failed. The Japanese captain twisted and turned, attempting to hide in the destroyer's wake. Pendleton then turned control of the ship over to Lieutenant Williamson. At 14:33 hours on the 5th run, Williamson aligned the England perfectly. 4 Hedgehog bombs struck the submarine almost simultaneously. A massive underwater detonation lifted the England's stern clear of the water and knocked crewmen off their feet. Within minutes, debris and a spreading oil slick confirmed the kill. I-16 had gone down with all hands. The England had drawn first blood in her very first action. The division pressed on. 2 days later, on May 22nd, radar contact was made with RO-106. The George opened the attack, but it was England that delivered the decisive Hedgehog salvo. One direct pattern produced a violent underwater explosion 7 minutes later. RO-106 never surfaced again. The pace quickened. On the morning of May 23rd, the Raby gained sonar contact on RO-104. 11 separate Hedgehog runs followed, yet the submarine evaded everyone. Once again, Williamson took command of the England's approach. A single, perfectly placed salvo struck home. 5 minutes later, another tremendous explosion marked the end of RO-104. By now, the pattern was unmistakable. The other ships might locate the enemy first. They might begin the hunt. But time after time, it was the England that closed the account. May 24th brought RO-116. The George made initial contact at 0200. England followed with 2 Hedgehog attacks that produced rumbling noises and minor detonations deep below. The submarine was damaged but still dangerous. Later that same morning, at 0950, the England regained contact alone and pressed home another attack. Rumbling sounds and vibrations followed. RO-116 was gone. The division continued its sweep southwest along the line. On May 26th, the Raby made contact with RO-108. The England moved in for the kill once more. A single salvo produced immediate underwater rumbling and violent vibrations. Debris and oil soon confirmed the destruction of the 5th submarine in just 8 days. Through each of these engagements, Lieutenant Williamson's relentless training paid ever greater dividends. The crew moved with calm precision. The Hedgehog crews loaded and fired with machine-like efficiency. Every approach was tighter, every salvo more accurate. The England was no longer learning her trade. She was mastering it. By the early hours of May 28th, the England had accounted for 5 Japanese submarines, 5 kills in 9 days, a record that already stood alone in the Pacific. The crew was exhausted but quietly confident. They had proven what a well-drilled Buckley-class escort armed with the Hedgehog could achieve when led by determined officers. Yet the most demanding test still lay ahead. The 6th and final encounter would test every lesson the England had learned. It began in the small hours of May 30th, 1944. At 0156, the destroyer Hazelwood, escorting the escort carrier Hoggett Bay, obtained radar contact on a surfaced submarine. The range was just 3,000 yards. Hazelwood closed rapidly and delivered a pattern of depth charges. No immediate results. The submarine dived. Hazelwood called for assistance. Commander Haynes dispatched the George and Raby, the closest units. England and the newly joined Spangler continued their patrol to the southwest, but they listened intently over the radio. For the next 16 hours, George and Raby maintained contact. They launched Hedgehog and depth charge attacks in steady succession. The submarine maneuvered with skill, diving deep, then shallow, using thermal layers and turns to break the sonar lock. Each time the American ships thought they had him, the contact faded, only to reappear minutes later. By 0310 on May 31st, the submarine was forced to surface again. Both George and Raby gained radar contact simultaneously. They raced toward the target, guns ready. The Japanese captain, Ryanosuke Kato, an experienced commander of Submarine Division 51, positioned RO-105 precisely between the 2 destroyers. He kept his boat in their line of fire, preventing either from opening up with accurate gunfire. For 5 critical minutes, RO-105 remained on the surface, replenishing air, while the American ships circled in frustration. Then he submerged once more. The hunt resumed with renewed intensity. The submarine was now damaged, leaking oil, perhaps with a bent periscope or flooded compartments, but still mobile. Oxygen was running low. Cato knew his time was limited. From 0400 onward, the attacks came in waves. George and Raby alternated runs. Hedgehog salvos splashed ahead, depth charges rolled off the sterns. Sonar operators reported explosions, rumbles, metallic clangs. Yet each time the submarine evaded destruction. The crews aboard George and Raby were nearing exhaustion. 21 separate attacks had been made by dawn. None had produced the telltale debris or oil slick that signaled a kill. England and Spangler, having reached the end of their patrol line, turned north. They could hear the radio traffic, the frustration, the terse reports of contact lost, contact regained, attack complete. No results. Williamson and Pendleton listened in silence. They knew their ship was low on ammunition and fuel, yet they pressed on. At 0649, George made another run. No hits. At 0659, Raby followed. No hits. At 0713, Spangler, new to the fight, took her turn. Still nothing. The radio crackled again. One of the pursuing captains spoke sharply. "We're not telling you where we are. We have a damaged sub, and we're going to sink him." The message was clear. Pride and fatigue had hardened into resolve. No one wanted to hand the kill to another ship after so much effort. Commander Haynes considered the situation. Then he made the decision. "Oh, hell! Go ahead, England." At 0729, the England steamed into the area. The other destroyers fell back slightly, maintaining contact but yielding the approach lane. Pendleton and Williamson worked in perfect coordination. The sonar operator tracked the submarine's slow, labored movements. Depth was estimated at 150 feet. Speed minimal. The England reduced to 12 knots for the final run, minimizing her own noise. The bridge crew watched the range close. 2,000 yards. 1,800. 1,650. Williamson gave the order. "Fire, Hedgehog!" 24 mortar bombs arced skyward in a tight fan pattern. They entered the water with sharp splashes, sinking quickly toward the target. 9.2 seconds later, the first detonations began. 6 to 10 bombs struck almost simultaneously. The explosions were deep and powerful, sharp cracks, followed by a long, rolling rumble that vibrated through the England's hull. The ship shuddered violently from bow to stern. Crewmen on deck braced themselves as the deck plates flexed. For a moment there was silence. Then came the confirmation. Massive bubbles rose to the surface, followed by thick oil slicks spreading across the water. Debris floated up. Wooden fragments, cork insulation, pieces of clothing. No survivors were seen. The RO-105 had been destroyed in a single, perfectly executed attack. In just 12 seconds from the moment the bombs left the mount to the final explosion, the longest and most grueling hunt of the campaign ended. The other ships closed in. They circled the oil slick, confirming the kill. No further contact. No counterattack. The RO-105 was gone, along with her entire crew of 55 officers and men. The England had done it again. After 30 hours of relentless pursuit by 3 other destroyers, 21 attacks without success, she had arrived, taken one precise shot, and ended the threat. The crews of George, Raby, and Spangler watched in a mixture of awe and quiet resignation. They had fought the battle. The England had claimed the victory. After 16 hours of unrelenting pressure, the submarine could no longer remain submerged. At 0310, RO-105 broke the surface. Both the George and the Raby gained simultaneous radar contact at a range of less than 4,000 yards. Their captains reacted instantly. Engines surged to full power. The two destroyers raced toward the contact, guns trained and ready. But the Japanese commander, Lieutenant Commander Ryonosuke Kato, was no ordinary captain. A veteran of Submarine Division 51, he had already survived multiple attacks that night. Now he executed a maneuver of cold precision. He held RO-105 steady on the surface and positioned her directly between the two oncoming American destroyers. The George and the Raby closed from opposite sides. Their forward guns could not be brought to bear without risking friendly fire on each other. For 5 long, agonizing minutes, the submarine remained on the surface, engines idling, hatches open, drawing in precious fresh air, while the American ships circled helplessly. Cato had turned the hunters into spectators. Aboard the George and Raby, frustration boiled over. Lookouts shouted ranges. Gunnery officers pleaded for permission to fire, but the line of sight remained blocked. Every second the submarine stayed up was another second it replenished its depleted oxygen and regained its balance. The radio traffic between the two destroyers grew terse and sharp. No one could get a clear shot. The submarine was damaged. Oil was already leaking from earlier depth-charge near misses, yet she refused to sink. Then, at the last possible moment, Cato gave the order. RO-105 slipped beneath the waves once more, disappearing from radar and sonar for the time being. The surface interval had bought the Japanese crew critical minutes of survival. The hunt, already 16 hours old, had just become even more personal. Aboard the England, still steaming north at speed, Lieutenant Williamson listened to every word over the radio. He could hear the exhaustion and the mounting anger in the voices of the other captains. He said nothing, but he knew the moment was coming when the England would be called forward. The cat-and-mouse game had entered its final, most dangerous phase. As dawn broke across the Pacific on the morning of May 31st, 1944, the hunt for RO-105 entered its most punishing phase. The crews of the George and the Raby had now been engaged for nearly 30 hours straight. Their ships were low on fuel, low on depth charges, and dangerously low on hedgehog ammunition. Yet the submarine refused to break. At 0649 hours, the George made another determined approach. Sonar reported firm contact at 200 yards. The forward hedgehog mount roared. 24 bombs streaked into the sea. The explosions came seconds later, deep, heavy rumbles transmitted through the hull. But when the sonar cleared, the contact was still there. No breakup noises. No oil. The submarine had survived once more. 10 minutes later, at 0659, the Raby took the lane. Another textbook run, another full salvo. The underwater detonations echoed across the water. Still nothing. The contact held steady, then faded and reappeared as the submarine slipped through another thermal layer. At 0713, the Spangler, newly arrived and eager, was given her chance. She closed in with fresh eyes and steady hands. Her hedgehog salvo fired true. The pattern entered the water perfectly. Explosions followed, contact lost, then regained within minutes. 21 separate attacks. 21 carefully executed runs by 3 different destroyers. Depth charges, hedgehog salvos, and relentless sonar pursuit. All had failed. Aboard the George, the Raby, and the Spangler, exhaustion had turned to raw frustration. Men who had stood at battle stations for a day and a half were hollow-eyed and silent. Voices on the radio grew shorter, sharper. The shared determination of the previous night had hardened into something close to defiance. Aboard the USS England, still closing from the southwest, Lieutenant John Williamson and Lieutenant Commander Pendleton listened to every word. They heard the fatigue, They heard the anger. They heard the unspoken plea behind every report of contact regained. Williamson stood quietly at the plot table, reviewing firing solutions for the 20th time. He knew the submarine was now critically low on oxygen. Her captain was fighting for survival with every last breath. The end was near, but only if someone could deliver the final blow. At 0728, Commander Hamilton Haines made the call that would end the longest hunt of the campaign. His voice came across the radio, tired yet decisive. "Oh, hell." A brief pause. "Go ahead, England." Commander Hamilton Haines had seen enough. His voice came across the radio, calm but final. "Oh, hell." A heartbeat of silence. "Go ahead, England." At 0729 exactly, the USS England moved into the attack lane. The other three destroyers eased back, maintaining sonar contact but yielding the final approach. Lieutenant Commander Pendleton and Lieutenant John Williamson worked in perfect unison on the bridge. The sonar operator's voice was steady. "Contact bearing 045, range 1,650 yards, depth 150 feet, speed near zero." The England slowed to 12 knots. Every man aboard held his breath. This was the moment months of relentless training had prepared them for. Williamson gave the order. "Fire Hedgehog." 24 mortar bombs launched in a single thunderous ripple. They arced high into the pale morning sky, then plunged into the sea ahead of the ship in a deadly fan pattern. For 9.2 agonizing seconds, nothing. Then the ocean erupted. 6 to 10 bombs struck the RO 105 almost simultaneously. The detonations were sharp, violent, and deep. A rolling shockwave slammed into the England's hull, shaking her from stem to stern. Men on deck grabbed railings. The entire ship trembled as though struck by a giant hammer. In the sonar room, the operator's voice cracked with excitement. "Multiple explosions, break-up noises, contact lost." Seconds later, the surface told the story. Huge bubbles burst upward in a widening circle. Thick black oil boiled to the surface in heavy, glistening slicks. Debris followed, wooden planks, pieces of cork, fragments of clothing and twisted metal. No periscope, no conning tower, nothing. The RO 105 had been destroyed in a single, perfectly placed salvo. By 0741, it was over. 12 seconds from the moment the Hedgehog bombs left their tubes until the final underwater explosion, the longest submarine hunt of the entire operation had ended. The crews of the George, the Raby, and the Spangler watched in stunned silence as the England steamed slowly through the spreading oil. After 30 hours of relentless pursuit and 21 failed attacks, one ship, one salvo, had delivered the kill. This was not merely a victory. This was the most brutal, most decisive Hedgehog attack of the Second World War. With the destruction of RO 105, the battle was over. In 12 extraordinary days, the men of Escort Division 39 had achieved what no other American force had done in the Pacific. 6 Japanese submarines had been sent to the bottom. Every single kill had been delivered by the USS England. 5 in the first 9 days, the 6th after the longest and most punishing hunt of the entire campaign. The England had entered the fight as a brand-new destroyer escort with almost no combat experience. She left it as the most successful submarine hunter in the theater. Lieutenant John Williamson's relentless training, the precision of the Hedgehog mortar, and the calm determination of her crew had turned theory into devastating reality. The impact reached far beyond the oil slicks left behind in the water. Admiral Suemu Toyoda's headquarters on Saipan received the fragmented reports with growing alarm. Japanese signals intelligence had already intercepted American messages confirming multiple submarine losses. By May 27th, Toyota realized the entire NA line had been compromised. He issued urgent orders for all remaining boats to withdraw westward immediately. Most obeyed. RO-109 and RO-112 broke off and escaped. RO-105 alone remained on station and paid the ultimate price. Submarine Squadron 7 had been effectively wiped out. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost its eyes and ears in one of the most critical sectors of the Pacific. The intelligence that might have warned them of the next American move was gone. Just weeks later, when the United States fleet appeared off the Mariana Islands for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese were caught unprepared. The destruction of those 6 submarines had blinded them at the decisive moment. The great carrier battle that followed would mark another turning point in the war. Back in the Pacific, the achievement of the England did not go unrecognized. In July 1944, the ship and her crew received the Presidential Unit Citation. It was one of the highest honors the United States Navy could bestow. The citation praised their outstanding performance against superior enemy forces and noted that their actions had materially contributed to the success of Allied operations. Only one other ship in the entire war could claim a comparable record. The British destroyer HMS Starling had sunk more submarines, but she had done so over the course of 3 long years in the Atlantic. The England had done it in less than 2 weeks. From a quiet escort vessel running routine convoys to the deadliest anti-submarine platform in the Pacific, the transformation had been complete. The men who served aboard her would carry that legacy for the rest of their lives. They had proven, beyond any doubt, what a single well-trained destroyer escort, armed with the right weapon and led with determination, could accomplish. The Hedgehog had spoken with finality. 1 shot, 1 kill, 6 times, and in doing so, the USS England had written one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of anti-submarine warfare. Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest legends are not born in the largest ships or the loudest battles, but in the quiet precision of men who simply refused to miss. The story of the USS England stands as one of the most remarkable chapters in the long history of naval warfare. In just 12 days, a single destroyer escort and her determined crew accomplished what entire flotillas had failed to do. 6 Japanese submarines, 6 decisive victories, all delivered by one ship. Her legacy reminds us that greatness is not always measured by the size of the vessel, but by the skill, discipline, and courage of those who sail her. If you would like to see the complete detailed account of all 6 submarine kills, from the very first Hedgehog attack on First 16 through every phase of the grueling hunt for RO-105, simply leave a comment below with the words England Legend. And if this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss future episodes of the most compelling naval history. Thank you for watching. This has been the account of the most brutal Hedgehog attack of the Second World War, carried out by the USS England. It was just before midnight, March 31st, 1944. Somewhere over the waters east of the Philippines, a Japanese flying boat was losing its fight with a typhoon. Inside that plane sat one of the most powerful admirals in the Imperial Japanese Navy, a man who had spent his entire career climbing to the very top of the most feared fleet in the Pacific. He was clutching a leather briefcase. The plane went down hard. Some men didn't make it out of the water that night. He did, barely. Half-conscious, gasping, clinging to whatever wreckage he could find in the dark. And the briefcase? Gone. In the days that followed, this admiral would find himself sitting across a table from American intelligence officers, calm, composed, giving them nothing. He had been trained for exactly this kind of moment, and he was certain, absolutely certain, that whatever those Americans were fishing for, they weren't going to find it. He was wrong, because what was inside that briefcase hadn't sunk to the bottom of the sea. It had already been read. To understand what was in that briefcase and why losing it mattered so much, you have to understand where Japan stood in the spring of 1944. 2 years earlier, Japan had seemed unstoppable. They had swept across the Pacific in a matter of months: the Philippines, Wake Island, Singapore, Burma, island after island, falling like dominoes. But then came Midway, in June of 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the backbone of their naval air power, sunk in a single afternoon. Japan lost not just ships that day. They lost experienced pilots, seasoned crews, and the kind of momentum that, once broken, is very hard to get back. Then Guadalcanal. 6 months of brutal fighting in the jungle and at sea, ending in a Japanese withdrawal in February of 1943. By early 1944, the tide had turned, and everyone on both sides knew it. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur were pushing westward across the Pacific with a strategy that confounded the Japanese at every turn. They called it island hopping. The idea was simple, but ruthless. You don't attack every Japanese stronghold. You pick your targets carefully. Take the ones that matter, cut off the ones that don't, and let the garrisons on bypassed islands wither on the vine. Japan couldn't defend everywhere at once, and they were beginning to realize it. The high command in Tokyo knew they needed something, a line they could hold, a strategy bold enough, comprehensive enough to stop the American advance before it reached the home islands. They called it the absolute national defense sphere, and to defend it, they needed a plan. That plan came from Admiral Mineichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the man who had stepped into the enormous shadow left by the death of the legendary Isoroku Yamamoto. Koga was not Yamamoto, but he was thorough, and he was serious. What he put together was called Operation Z. It was not a single document so much as a complete blueprint for how Japan intended to fight and win the next great naval battle of the war. It laid out where the fleet would be positioned, which island chains would be defended at all costs, how the Navy's air power would be coordinated with ground forces, what Japan would do if the Americans came from the east, what they would do if they came from the south. Every contingency, every fallback, every card Japan still had to play, written down, organized, and stamped with the highest classification in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Only a handful of senior officers were ever allowed to read it. Koga kept one copy. He gave another to his Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, with instructions to keep it secure during their upcoming transfer of headquarters. It was, to put it plainly, the single most sensitive document in the Japanese Pacific Command. And Fukudome put it in a briefcase and carried it onto an airplane in the middle of typhoon season. Now, who was Shigeru Fukudome? He was, by any measure, the product of a system designed to produce men who did not fail. He had graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy at Itajima, the Japanese equivalent of Annapolis, but with a reputation for being even more demanding, more unforgiving, more focused on instilling a particular kind of pride in the men who passed through its gates. Fukudome had risen steadily through the ranks over more than 2 decades. Staff assignments, command postings, the kind of career that doesn't happen by accident. By 1944, he was one of Koga's most trusted officers, and he carried with him the confidence of a man who had spent 30 years being told and believing that the Imperial Japanese Navy was a force no enemy could fully understand, let alone defeat. That confidence would serve him well in a great many situations. In a small room, sitting across from American interrogators, it would become something else entirely. It would become a blindfold. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, there was the storm. By late March of 1944, the situation at Truk had become untenable. Truk Lagoon, once considered Japan's most formidable naval fortress in the Central Pacific, had been hit hard by American carrier aircraft in February. Ships sunk at anchor, planes destroyed on the ground. The base that Tokyo had counted on as an anchor point for the entire Pacific defense was no longer safe. Admiral Koga made the decision to move. Combined Fleet headquarters would relocate south, from Palau to Davao, in the Philippines. On the evening of March 31st, 2 aircraft were prepared for departure. Koga would take one plane. Fukudome would take the other. It was a routine precaution. Senior commanders traveling separately, so that one bad stroke of luck couldn't take out both men at once. No one in Palau that night had a reliable weather report. The forecasting equipment available to Japanese forces in 1944 simply wasn't up to the task of tracking a typhoon moving fast across open water. They flew into the dark, and the dark had a storm waiting in it. What happened next unfolded in 2 very different ways, and the contrast between them is something history has never fully resolved. Koga's plane vanished. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors. The commander-in-chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet simply disappeared into the night sky and was never seen again. For weeks, Tokyo kept his death a secret, telling no one outside the innermost circle of command for fear of what the news might do to morale. It remains, to this day, one of the genuine unsolved mysteries of the Second World War. Fukudome's plane went down differently. It hit the water hard, somewhere off the coast of Cebu. Men were lost. The aircraft was destroyed. But Fukudome survived, pulled from the wreckage by local civilians who had heard the crash and gone out into the storm to look. He was alive, and somewhere in the dark water behind him, or washed up on a stretch of beach he couldn't see, the briefcase had come to rest in someone else's hands. The Philippines in 1944 was occupied territory. Japanese forces had controlled the islands since the spring of 1942, following the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. But occupation is not the same as control. Across the Philippine archipelago, a network of guerrilla fighters had kept the resistance alive, operating in the hills and jungles, maintaining contact with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia through clandestine radio links. These were not amateurs. Many were former soldiers of the Philippine Commonwealth Army, men who had fought at Bataan, who had escaped capture, and who had spent 2 years waiting for the chance to do something that mattered. When the briefcase surfaced near Cebu, it made its way quickly up the chain of command to Colonel Ruperto Canglian, one of the most capable guerrilla commanders in the islands. Canglian understood immediately that what he was holding was not an ordinary set of military papers. He passed it through secure channels to SWPA, Southwest Pacific Area Intelligence, the American command operating out of Australia under General MacArthur. The documents were translated, they were studied, they were understood, and then the Japanese made a move that confirmed just how much those papers were worth. A Japanese naval vessel arrived off the coast of Cebu. The demand was straightforward. Return the documents. Return the prisoner. Canglian and his men said no. Let that sit for a moment. These were Filipino guerrillas, lightly armed, operating in secret, under occupation, staring down a Japanese warship and refusing to hand over what they had found. They knew what a no might cost them. They said it anyway. The documents stayed where they were. Fukudome remained in custody, and the clock, though no one knew it yet, had already begun to run. Fukudome was transferred to American custody within days of his capture. He was not mistreated. He was not broken down. He was simply placed in a room with officers from the Office of Naval Intelligence and asked questions. Here is what Fukudome knew at that moment. He knew he had been in a plane crash. He knew he had been pulled from the water. He knew he was a prisoner of war. And he believed, with complete conviction, that the briefcase he had been carrying was somewhere at the bottom of the sea. That belief was the foundation of everything that followed in that room. He sat down across from his interrogators, carrying the full weight of a career built on the assumption that Japan's secrets were impenetrable. And he gave them nothing. That is not a dramatization. That is what the historical record shows. Fukudome did not cooperate. He did not answer questions about fleet dispositions. He did not discuss defensive strategy. He did not confirm or deny anything of substance. When the Americans asked about Japanese intentions in the Central Pacific, silence. When they pressed him on the Mariana Islands, on carrier deployments, on the chain of command after Koga's disappearance, he gave them the kind of answers that aren't really answers. General, vague, carefully nothing. He had been trained for precisely this, and from where he sat, there was no reason to believe the training wasn't working. The Americans were asking questions, which meant, as far as he could tell, they were still searching, still guessing, still trying to piece together a picture from fragments they didn't fully understand. He was not going to help them finish it. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that they had already finished it, weeks ago, without him. Post-war accounts, not a verbatim transcript, but accounts from those who were there, suggest that at some point during the interrogation, the Americans placed something on the table in front of him, a translated copy of the Z-Plan. His Z-Plan, the document he had been carrying, the document he believed was gone. There are no dramatic words recorded for this moment, no outburst, no confession. What the accounts describe is simpler than that, and in some ways more devastating. He looked at what was on the table, and he understood. Not that he had been broken by a clever interrogator, not that he had slipped up or said too much or given something away under pressure. He understood something worse than any of that. He understood that he had lost before he ever sat down in that chair. The briefcase had not gone to the bottom of the sea. The people who pulled him from the water had not been bystanders with no idea what they were holding. The Americans had not been guessing. They had known, from the moment those documents landed on a desk in Australia, exactly what Japan was planning, exactly where Japan intended to make its stand, and exactly how Japan expected the next great battle of the war to unfold. Every careful non-answer he had given in that room had been, in a sense, unnecessary. They hadn't needed him to talk. They had needed him to sit there while they confirmed what they already knew. That is what broke him, not his will, not his composure, but the architecture of the advantage he had counted on. It was gone. Fukudome was eventually returned to Japan in a prisoner exchange. He went home. He resumed his duties. He told almost no one what had happened in that room. But the Z-Plan did not go home with him. And 11 weeks after a typhoon brought down his plane, the consequences of that night were about to arrive at full force. By June of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was playing with what remained of its cards, and what remained was still considerable, but only if used exactly right, at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place. The Americans were moving on the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. For Japan, this was not a peripheral concern. The Marianas sat inside what Tokyo had designated the innermost ring of the empire's defense. Lose them, and American B-29 bombers, the largest, longest-range aircraft in the world at that time, would be within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. There was no fallback position beyond the Marianas. This was the line. Japan's naval commanders knew it. They had updated the Z plan into a new operational order called Operation A-Go, after learning that the original documents had been compromised. New name, new details, but the underlying logic, the fundamental shape of how Japan intended to fight this battle, that hadn't changed. Because strategic thinking doesn't reset overnight. You can change the pieces on the board. You cannot so easily change the mind of the man moving them. And the Americans, having read the Z plan cover to cover, understood that mind very well. The Japanese fleet launched its attack in 4 waves. Nearly 500 aircraft, fighters, torpedo bombers, dive bombers rose from carrier decks and headed east toward the American task force. It was, on paper, an overwhelming force. What the Japanese pilots flew into was not what they expected. The Americans had radar, not just the basic early warning equipment that both sides had been using for years, but a system refined through 2 years of combat experience, operated by men who knew exactly how to read it, supported by a fighter direction network that could put the right planes in the right place faster than anything Japan had developed. The Hellcat, the Navy's frontline fighter in 1944, was a different animal from what Japan had faced earlier in the war. Faster, tougher, better armed, and flown by pilots who had been training while Japanese pilot training had been quietly falling apart, gutted by 2 years of attrition. The first Japanese wave ran into American fighters while still more than 60 miles from the fleet. The second wave fared no better. By the time the third and fourth waves arrived, the pattern was already clear, and there was nothing Japan could do to change it. American pilots, coming back to their carriers that evening, were loose with their words on the radio. One of them called it a turkey shoot. The name stuck. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft were destroyed over those 2 days. 2 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk by American submarines on the same day, going down even as their own aircraft were still in the air above them. It was the end of Japanese carrier aviation as a functional force. They would never fully reconstitute it. Now, a fair question deserves a straight answer. Did the Z plan cause all of this? Historians have debated that for 80 years, and the honest answer is not directly, not alone. American radar, American pilots, American aircraft, those were the instruments of the destruction. But here is what the Z plan gave the Americans that no amount of radar could provide. It gave them the architecture of Japanese thinking. Not just where Japan would deploy its ships, but how Japan's commanders expected a battle to unfold. What they would do when the first wave failed. How they would respond when the plan started to unravel. The Americans didn't just know Japan's moves. They understood that Japan had no real contingency when those moves didn't work. A briefcase left a plane. Filipino guerrillas made a choice. An admiral sat in a room and said nothing because he thought there was nothing left to say. 11 weeks, from the night of the crash to the morning of the turkey shoot. That is how long it took for one lost briefcase to help unravel the last great naval air campaign Japan would ever launch. Wars end, and the people who lived through them go on, or they don't. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome went on. He continued to serve through the final year of the war, commanding forces in various theaters as Japan's situation grew darker by the month. He survived the surrender in August of 1945. In the years that followed, he was called to testify at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Allied prosecutors spent years trying to untangle who had ordered what, and who had known what, and who bore responsibility for the conduct of the war. Fukudome testified. He was not convicted of war crimes. He lived quietly in post-war Japan until his death in 1971. By most accounts, he never spoke publicly about what had happened in that interrogation room. Some things, apparently, a man keeps to himself. Admiral Koga, the man who designed the Zed plan, the man whose plane vanished the same night Fukudome's went down, was never found. Tokyo awarded him a posthumous promotion to the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy. A formal honor for a man whose fate the sea had never seen fit to explain. And Ruperto Kangleian, the guerrilla commander who had received the briefcase, who had looked a Japanese warship in the eye and said no, he became the Secretary of National Defense of the Philippines after the war. He had earned it. Here is something worth sitting with before we close. Almost every account of the Zed Plan affair, in American military histories, in naval archives, in the books written by scholars on both sides of the Pacific, tells the story from two directions: Japanese and American, the briefcase, the interrogation, the battle. Kangleian and his guerrillas appear, if they appear at all, as a brief footnote between the crash and the translation, a handoff, a logistical detail. That is not what they were. They were an occupied people living under a military force that had demonstrated repeatedly and without ambiguity what happened to those who resisted. They did not have radar. They did not have carriers. They did not have the full picture of what was in those documents or what it might mean for the war. What they had was the briefcase and a Japanese warship sitting offshore telling them to hand it over, and the understanding that their answer was going to have consequences either way. They chose the harder answer. That choice, made in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map, by men whose names don't appear in most history books, was as consequential as anything that happened in any interrogation room or any admiral's quarters. History has a habit of remembering the people with the biggest ships. It doesn't always do right by the people who made the biggest difference. You don't need a fleet to change a war. Sometimes it's a storm moving faster than the forecasts said it would. A briefcase that didn't sink when it should have. A group of fighters who decided that some things were worth the risk. One piece of information in the right hands, at the right moment, can do what no armada can. That was true in 1944. It is still true today. Before you go, I want to be straight with you about something. The title of this video says, "The Admiral laughed at his interrogators." I don't know that he laughed. No transcript records it. No first-hand account confirms it. What the record does show is that he didn't cooperate, that he sat in that room, composed and unbothered, certain that the Americans were working without the information they needed. That certainty, that calm, trained confidence, is what the title is reaching for. Whether there was a smile on his face, I honestly cannot tell you. The title also says, "One map broke him." It wasn't one map. It was a full set of operational documents. And broke is a strong word for a man who gave away nothing and went home. What broke, if that's the right word, was the position he thought he held. The sense that he was protecting something that had, in fact, already been lost. That is a real thing that happened. It just happened more quietly than a title can capture in a single line. The real story, a typhoon, a briefcase, and a group of Filipino fighters who refused to stand down, doesn't need much help from me to be remarkable. It already is.